Traction, we just launched our marquee report for this program yesterday. It's a research agenda for just and sustainable transportation. And to introduce that report, I'd like to play a video from Adam Millard-Ball, who was the principal investigator for the Traction program. Adam is a professor of urban and regional planning at UCLA, acting director of the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies last year, and would be here except for that he's in sabbatical in Berlin right now, and it's a very far way to come to deliver 2 minutes of remarks. But with modern technology, we can save a lot of greenhouse gas emissions and get 90% of that benefit. So I'm going to let Adam introduce Traction.
Traction is fundamentally about what are the most important research questions for transportation sustainability in Southern California, but also about who gets to be part of that research development process. Because usually there's two groups that decide on research priorities. There's professors like me and other university researchers, and there's also funders, for example, California state agencies or Federal Department of Transportation. But that leaves out a lot of other stakeholders. It leaves out community groups and advocates who might have a very different perspective on what are the critical transportation issues that researchers should be addressing. And that's where Traction comes in. So what's different about Traction is we're not just taking ideas from academia and trying to translate them, to try and make the results relevant to communities and to government agencies. Rather, we want to start further upstream. We want to identify the research ideas, but start with community-based thinkers. And then through Traction and beyond, we can develop them into cross-disciplinary scholarly projects. So Traction is certainly going to help guide ITS's own research priorities, but I hope it also has a wider influence on the transportation research agenda. So both for public agencies that work on transportation or fund research, but also making the links to transportation for organizations that don't see themselves in this space, but do care about social justice or the environment or economic development.
Thank you, Adam. So in moving towards an equitable research agenda, we look to move the research closer to community needs and policy needs by bringing those people with interests and expertise in those areas together. This very busy slide is a look at the process that we started in January 23. In order to match UCLA's academic expertise with the wisdom and perspectives of community groups and advocates. We convened about over 4 dozen researchers and external partners to form working groups around topic areas like phasing out fossil fuels, access to opportunities, reimagining transportation, resilient transportation, and safe and healthy transportation. And these are oriented around problems that we see in the transportation sector rather than around academic fields. Too often when academia does research planning, it's siloed within an academic field, which precludes a lot of opportunity to hear about challenges and potential research. So these working groups met 5 times over the course of the working group process, and identified more than 100 ideas of important barriers, gaps, and solutions to creating a just transportation transition in Los Angeles. These were then synthesized into 5 cross-cutting themes across all groups: decision-making processes, institutional effectiveness, access in public space, determinants of individual behavior, and environment and health. And so this is a view of the synthesis meeting, the final working group meeting of the 17 that we had at the Luskin School of Public Affairs. So today we are releasing the Traction Report, a research agenda for just and sustainable transportation, which you can see a QR code on the tents in front of you. So this agenda is organized around community-focused themes and identifies specific questions that can be taken forward by researchers, community partners, or transportation agencies and elected officials. The resultant cross-cutting themes include decision-making processes, institutional effectiveness, access in public space, determinants of individual behavior, and environment and health. The Traction Research Agenda will inform the priorities of UCLA ITS in our attempts to fill knowledge gaps with new research and synthesize findings to inform policymakers. Research has a great potential to affect decision-making, and Traction serves as a model for integrating community voices into the research development process and aligning academic research more closely with their visions for the future. So here's a look at some of the selected findings from the conclusion and executive summary. So one of those is that there's a need to move beyond technical data and unlocking equitable decision-making. In many areas of policy, there is sufficient credible technical information already for agencies to make informed decisions. The most pertinent questions then relate to how and why these decisions are made, particularly when the status quo perpetuates inequities and/or environmental degradation. In addition, we found that there's a need to move beyond engineering and address interdisciplinary research needs in transportation. So there are still many areas where basic knowledge gaps remain. Some of these relate to engineering questions, such as cost-effective systems to inventory sidewalk quality and extent. Others, for example, aggressive driving or contracting by public agencies, are the domain of psychology, sociology, economics, and public administration. A lot of transportation research is not in these fields, or a lot of the potential for transportation research is not in these fields. Existing transportation research does not make it into these fields so much. We found that there's a need to shift the focus of transportation research. So de-emphasizing congestion and technology. Some themes, and these are often themes that are central to many federal and state calls for research proposals, like reducing traffic congestion and transportation infrastructure, did not emerge as priorities from the Traction process, which I think was much more focused on people and outcomes. Shifting focus, focusing emphasis on technology, and participants highlighted the way that technology can provide solutions to pressing transportation problems, but also highlighted the way that it can create problems when pursued for the sake of novelty. There's also the issue of unintended consequences of new technology, which we can expect from most technological transitions in transportation. The automobiles helped relieve were technology that helped to relieve the problem of horse waste in cities and have created their own problems. So one area for research relates to the potential for unintended consequences from new technologies, such as safety and emissions impacts of electric vehicles, whose greater weight amplifies the risk to pedestrians and increases particulate emissions from brake and tire wear. We also were able to draw connections between Los Angeles and global issues. For example, though we did find that some of what we were studying in Southern California were more salient to the specific context here. So for example, the region's high housing costs mean that income inequality also manifests in unequal access and opportunities, much more so than other regions. We had a conclusion about a guide for transportation change based on planning, piloting, and communicating. So we looked more into the public administration research, which suggests that public agencies can take a more strategic approach to more effectively address policy and implementation gaps rooted in values gaps. And this report contains some modest suggestions for public sector leadership to consider for using planning processes and pilot projects, framing transportation decisions, and communicating broadly about transportation change. So these are suggestions about using what planning is good at more effectively in order to produce transportation change. And then in navigating the political landscape, it's really important to acknowledge that much of the work of policy change is inherently political. Policymakers can navigate political and values gaps through strategic use of planning processes, coalition building, expanding the focus of transportation, decision-making pilots, and demonstrative pilots. And we find sometimes we're asked to do work to create new knowledge where these are really the barriers to creating change. So in rethinking transportation research, collaboration is key to change. Traction is at its heart a process to develop a community-driven research agenda for sustainable and equitable transportation. Many working group participants' priorities are related to issues that represent values gaps or political gaps between groups of people. But that leads us to grapple with another potential research question, which is how effective is the work we do, transportation research, in influencing policymaker decisions. And there's research on how to make it more effective, and we're accessing that research. Additionally, fields traditionally viewed as separate from transportation studies like political science, social psychology, and sociology have emerged as truly important to organizations engaging in the work of addressing values and political gaps in transportation. Transportation researchers may have an opportunity to collaborate in more broad and unique ways that creates research centered on shifting governance, culture, and behavior towards community visions of equity and their needs. So we have a large report, but we have it in bite-sized pieces. So this is a look at the table of contents. And before we learn more about the Traction Working Group process from participants on the first panel, I wanted to orient you to the report so that when you all get emails about it later today, scan the QR code, you know what you're looking at. So we start with an executive summary, 7 pages for breezy reading to introduce the results, some of which I've just gone over now. The report includes an overview of the current transportation system in Los Angeles and its challenges in a section titled Transportation Sustainability in Los Angeles. And that really, I think that baseline issues of transportation motivates why we see a need for transforming transportation and transformative approaches to do so. The next section on developing a research agenda includes additional information about the processes you'll hear about in the next session and the cross-cutting themes that working group participants identified. The document also includes 11 literature reviews on the cross-cutting themes and future research that can help advance transportation justice and sustainability. The report also includes implications for politics and policymaking, recognizing again that many problems that affect transportation justice and sustainability arise from values gaps rather than a lack of knowledge about problems and how to address them. And then in all the report cites over 260 sources. Here's an example of one of those 11 literature reviews and recommendations for future research on transportation in a changing climate, such as how are climate impacts that we might expect in Los Angeles going to create additional stresses for those who currently use multimodal transportation systems. So we're all gathered here together in this room, not in a public meeting in the middle of a Los Angeles street, to learn more about how to affect this agenda and how we can be working together to create a positive transportation future. And with that, I would like to invite our first panel onto the stage, including moderator Madeline Brosen, who will introduce those that you'll be hearing from to really learn more about this process, how it worked, and the ideas that were discussed within it. All right.
Oscar, you're going, yeah.
Hey, go.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and have this opportunity. My name is Madeline Rosen. I'm the Deputy Director at the Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies. The Lewis Center, for those of you that might not know us or our work, focuses on planning and policy issues relating to the greater Southern California region. So really the traction efforts to bring a lot of our community partners together was a really great chance to kind of see, you know, what is the ecosystem of people in Los Angeles that are working to make a difference. Our work focuses on transportation equity and housing affordability. And so today's conversation is really relevant to that. So I'm going to go ahead and quickly introduce the panelists and mostly just kind of help lead a conversation among them. You know, when Juan asked me to do this, it was just kind of almost like this is too easy. These are people that I greatly respect, and I think we're going to get a chance to learn from them a lot. So first we have Oscar Zarate. Oscar is the Director of Advocacy and Organizing at SAGE, where he works on the built environment, focusing on a combination of efforts to improve the conditions of rental housing and public transit. Next, we have Andres Ramirez. Andres is the Executive Director of People for Mobility Justice. In this role and his previous, with his previous organizations, he's led advocacy on land use, transportation, housing, environmental policies, all focused around the idea of equitable implementation. And finally, we have Dr. Tierra Bills. Dr. Bills is Assistant Professor of Civil Engineering and Public Policy, and Tierra's research focuses on travel behavior and travel demand models and getting those models to work better, really making sure that they are incorporating the experiences of people who are just not captured in these things. So let's just go ahead and welcome our panelists. So, you know, as Juan mentioned, our event today is really focusing on how, you know, what are the processes that we can think about doing in terms of, you know, getting these big ideas into practice, getting them into people's lives. And part of that was, you know, this traction effort and these working groups were really deliberate way where we just had a number of conversations that have it really open-ended and had the opportunity to really hear from people. I think it was a great opportunity to both also just kind of introduce and build relationships among the kind of broader community outside of academia and a lot of our academic partners at UCLA. So first, I just want to kind of open it up and have you all hear from our panelists about, you know, what kind of their perspective on the traction experience. What was it like? And I think especially for Oscar and Andres, like, why did you agree to sign up?
Can we go first? Go first. Is it still morning? Good morning, everybody. How was the experience? I really liked it. I found the conversations comprehensive and fruitful. I think everybody who was in our research process brought a different perspective that painted the full picture of what transportation is, not only to the ones who operate it, but also to the writers. And I think that's really the conversations that interest me, right? Bridging the gap between people who look or people who have to look at transportations through systems and people who are just getting on the bus to go to school or to go to work or to drop their kids off to school. Yeah, and for me, I think I really loved the inquisitive nature of the people facilitating the process. And I think the openness to the ideas that people like me and Andres brought forward. I think Juan mentioned it in the beginning, but you know, some of the things that, again, practitioners prioritize are not the things that, you know, Maria from 55th Street prioritizes. So yeah, I'll leave it there and I'll pass it over to the homie, Andres.
I agree with what Oscar is saying. I think one thing that I did feel was missing from the experience was more opportunity to like have dialogue amongst participants. It was a lot of presentation and reflection on data and research and that kind of stuff, right? Which is good, right? But I think the most fruitful part I felt from the symposium was the chat we had along a fire pit, right? Where we were talking about what are the pertinent issues in the region, what's coming, what do we see in the landscape, right? And what are the opportunities for us to collaborate, to engage? What are the research needs that we're seeing on the ground? That kind of stuff. And I think having more space for that dialogue, I think would be really, really fruitful. I also feel more diversity in the room, to be frank, right? Like, it's not a lot of people of color in the room, to be honest with you, right? Not a perspective of Maria from 55th Street. And their perspective are important. And I think that's a piece that like Oscar and I are very, passionate about, really, really uplifting, right? The perspective of community members who may not be, high level education, but their experience, their knowledge is valuable to the work that you all are doing. And it's important to take that expertise into mind when crafting these ideas, right? And not just being good enough that Oscar can represent that perspective, because he can to a certain extent, but it's better hear it from the source, right?
Exactly.
And taking the moments to make that space in that room accessible for multiple languages, even the language you're using in English, right? Not being jargony and being actually, a community-friendly language, right? So that was some of the perspectives I took from the symposium.
Yeah, go ahead.
You're talking about not the traction, but the symposium, right?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I was talking about the symposium. I agree with you. It was very, very, very wide for sure. I agree with. I think there was a lot of presentations. I think some of the topics that were talked about were not super relatable to some of the community organizing that our organization does. But yeah, I agree with you on the symposium. I was talking about traction. My bad.
Yeah. So Andres, if you want to kind of also just kind of give some of your thoughts on the kind of, like before the Arrowhead events, but kind of the process and the research agenda and kind of those, that process. I don't know if you want to kind of add anything on, if you go back a year, not just kind of 6 months, like the kind of working groups and conversations related to that.
To the traction process?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about
Problem. No.
My bad. No, I mean, I think traction is definitely was a very good model for what I was talking about, having more community engagement, more dialogue amongst community members and researchers. And I think it's reflective in the report, right? Identifying the needs weren't necessarily aligned with what is typically prioritized through research, right? I think it really opened up dialogues about the necessary data that folks on the ground need to do their advocacy work, to do their, programmatic work, right? Because a lot of what we do is piloting a lot of times for agencies, the type of work that's going to work in our communities, as opposed to the cookie cutter approach that's often done, right? So I do appreciate that process. I mean, I think that it was very transparent, and it was very open to pivoting, right? Because we came into the room and be like, yeah, this is not it, right? We see something else, and folks were like, yeah, that's great. Let's go with that. Let's go with that. It's different from the agenda we have created, but we understand, right? We understand that this is a priority that you all are uplifting, and we definitely wanna uplift that. I would say though, more space for community members in that space, because I think that's the other piece of it. I think that's the point still the same, right? Yeah. Often it's easy to look for an executive director of an organization to represent a community. But I think creating space for the community members themselves, working people, making the space accessible, not doing it during business hours when folks have to work, right? But doing an evening meeting or doing a weekend meeting to make it more accessible to folks. And then the language piece, I think that's the other one still applies, right? Because it's intimidating to someone who you're walking to a room full of professors and they're talking in fancy language. You're like, I don't know about if I could keep up here, right? but really valuing like, no, we really want to hear your perspective. We really want to hear what you got to say, and say it in the way that you want to say it. So.
Great, thank you. Tierra?
Yeah, so thank you all for having me. I think I'm gonna try to talk a little bit about the work that I do and give some examples of why I think this process has really been important. And the conclusion for me is that the traction process was a really important start to a model that I think we should be using to promote community engagement and co-development of research agendas between community members, community advocates, community workers, and the research and academic community. So I work in, I'm an engineer and a public policy person. So I have a split appointment at UCLA, and my training is in travel behavior analysis and travel demand modeling. And the long story short is that these tools that we use to support transportation decision making are very data driven. And so my work recognizes that it's pretty essential to work directly with community partners to understand what the needs are, to design data collection approaches. And part of that is driven by looking at the available tools. And so looking at the available data sets that we have, we can identify issues related to representativeness. And so the reality that the people that we want to support when it comes to, providing transportation improvements for the most vulnerable members of society, at the same time, they are not often well reflected in the data that we use to support decision-making. And so, part of the solution is making sure that, one, we have opportunities to do things like collect data and offer community workshops, and so that we can validate in real time the success of those data collection strategies. And so I do a lot of this sort of, empirical work where I go out and I say, hey, we need to understand transportation needs in this community. Let's couple our typical sort of paper and online surveys with community workshops so that we can talk with community members, so that we can offer opportunities to learn about how to perhaps revise those strategies. And what that boils down to is trying to conduct research in a way that we recognize the importance of co-development. And it's not just about going in and taking data and information, but it's about working with communities, working with community advocates and activists to understand what the needs are, what the priorities should be. And so, this is a really important part of my research. And so, this traction process has really been essential. And I didn't know what to expect when I went into the process, but, I learned about, these guys here and the work that they do. And I learned about, what the perspectives are. And, just like they said, often what we think about as important for improving transportation is not necessarily what people want, right? And so an example of that would be, if we think about all of the investments that we have in research around connected autonomous vehicles and in AI and machine learning, and the reality is that people need to get from point A to point B reliably, right? They need to do that so that they don't lose their job or sacrifice, potential negative health outcomes because they can't get to healthcare. Make sure that they can access open space and daycare and all these important and essential destinations. And so there's some fundamental questions that we haven't answered, right? But at the same time, the incentives, I think, on the academic side are to go after these, very, very fancy and very flashy sort of transportation improvements. So, this was a really important process. And again, I think that this is something that we need to have more participation in from transportation engineering and planning so that we can learn how to meet each other somewhere in the middle and recognize the significance of co-development in the research process.
Yeah, I think that really kind of highlights that there's for any, different types of organizations, there's so many roles and ways for people to think about, engaging in different ways. And so I think that kind of feeds into the next question. There's kind of an idiom or saying that kind of culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? And so we can have the strategy, we can have agendas, we can have priorities, but if the culture of the, organizations or people that are engaging in that really, are just different or aren't really meeting each other, then how are you actually kind of going to get to the outcomes or this, really implementing the strategy? So, and maybe we'll kind of go in reverse order and we'll kind of pepper in, feel free to jump in on each other's, but just want to acknowledge, and this is probably very obvious, but the culture of academia and the culture of advocacy and the culture of organizing, like these are very distinct, different things. And so I kind of want each of you to think about, share a little bit about kind of what is the culture within those spaces. And then how do you think about, what can be influential in kind of having these different cultures come together for common agendas? So Tierra, do you want to start?
Yeah, so I mean, there's so many things to say. But so my, most of my career so far has been in a civil engineering discipline. So as a more of a traditional transportation engineering environment, but at the same time, my work has always been focused on equity and bias and disadvantaged communities and how all of these approaches sort of break down when it comes to trying to understand how impacts will be distributed across different groups. And so the culture in, I would say, in a transportation engineering environment is, we don't often think about the importance of community engagement. This is something I can remember one of my first projects where I said, well, we're going to go and do some community workshops. And we began doing them. And for me, it was just kind of like, I'm just going to dive in because the people we're working with, like, these are people who look like my aunties and uncles and cousins, right? And so for me, it was like, okay, how do I, on one hand, address what our needs are, which is to collect data, but also do that in a way that is, we're not using jargon and we're trying to make people comfortable, allow them to ask questions, provide space for them to talk and share, which is a very non-traditional and very quickly evolving process. And so this is not a big part of, I think, typical transportation engineering research. The objectives are more about design, and we forget that, okay, well, if there are people who will use these systems, and if we're not focusing on understanding people and needs, we can't meet our engineering objectives, right? And so this idea is, it's present among some, but at the same time, I don't think that it's made its way into the way that we teach transportation engineering, right? It's not made its way into, the things that researchers and faculty are evaluated based on, right? So this idea of doing community engaged research, I think is very new. I think that there are many people who do recognize the significance, especially at places like UCLA, but by and large, it's not recognized as a significant contribution to sort of the intellectual merit of the work. And so I would say that's where we are. And for me, it's been, very much trying to buck that narrative because, right, we're trying to design transportation services that will provide utility for people that has a very important sort of, application is important, right? And so it's not just about design and efficiency and minimizing costs and things like that. It's about making sure that we're serving people at the end of the day. And so for me, that means talking to people, that means talking to community advocates that work with vulnerable travelers, because there is a such thing as survey fatigue. So we can't always go back to the same people to ask them, questions to meet our objectives when they have very pressing day-to-day needs. So yeah, so I hope that sums it up. So yeah, it's not a part of, traditionally what transportation engineers do, but it's essential. And so my hope is that through programs like this, we'll recognize the significance of it. I see my own work as sort of a model for how we can do these things and how we can meet our objectives in a more comprehensive and meaningful way by recognizing the essential role of people and experiences.
Yeah, and before Andres jumps in there, Tierra, I wonder if you can kind of just demystify a little bit, kind of from your own work, when you went, how did you go from taking kind of these experiences in these workshops and kind of hearing people's information and experiences, and then actually kind of figure out how you add that into the research process? Can you kind of just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, how do I figure it out? So I think, for me, it's a lot of it is tied to my own experiences. And everything from where I grew up in the city of Detroit, and recognizing that transportation for people in this neighborhood looks very different from the transportation of people in this other neighborhood, or recognizing that for certain communities, they very rarely leave their own neighborhood, and travel about the city, or looking at the state of bus transit service in Detroit versus in the suburban areas or other cities. And so for me, it was always this clear thing that, transportation looks different for different people. And so learning, in grad school about how to do transportation engineering and how to think about planning and objectives, it was not a difficult thing to recognize that, okay, we're assuming that everyone has the same experiences, right? We're assuming that everyone's behavior is reflected in this, very simple sort of linear model, right? And so I think from the beginning, I was always asking questions like, how do things look for low-income travelers? And how do things look for communities that are experiencing low levels of accessibility from the beginning? Well, how do things look for people with disadvantages? And so I feel like this has always been a part of my thinking. But in terms of how to embed that into the research, it was something like, as I learned through grad school and experiences, just kind of interrogating the approaches and asking questions. And, before I knew it, I discovered, so, it was new to me, right? This whole world of environmental justice and, equity in transportation. I think at the time, which is, at this point over 10 years ago, this was like, not something that engineers did. And so I think over time, it's just been, this sort of complex mixture of thinking about my own life and experiences, this perspective that, people will benefit from the transportation system in different ways. Different people pay the costs of the transportation system, and just always a concerted effort of recognizing that when I am doing research. And so at this point, that's the primary goal, is to make sure that the tools that we use for transportation decision-making are capable of recognizing these differences in experiences, so that we can have outcomes that actually align with the needs of community members.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much. I think it's a kind of a good, just kind of demystifying. So Andres, what do you think, can you share a little bit about the culture of advocacy and how that kind of culture is a really good, its contributions, and how it kind of knits together with these others to kind of create this community-based research agenda?
Yeah, I mean, the culture around advocacy is really about making sure that the voices of people being impacted are heard, right? And challenging extractive systems of engaging both with agencies and research. That's been the history for a long time in our communities, right? People parachute into our community, extract whatever they need, and then they parachute out, right? And we don't see them again. And I think we're trying to challenge, I think the culture nowadays is really being more strategic of how we're engaging with partners, right? Making sure that values are aligning, right? Because, I mean, I think the other piece around the culture around advocacy, and it's kind of the same with organizing, right? Equity is the sexy language in the land right now, right? Everybody's an equity champion, but the language of equity has really gotten co-opted. People just throw the word out there to say that, I'm not racist, I love equity, right? But the reality is equity is more about practice, right? Equity is more about results. And I think that's the piece that we're more interested in. And that's always our first question when engaging with folks, like, well, how do you define equity, right? Because people have a bunch of definitions of equity. We've seen them, right? And more those definitions are trying to maintain the status quo of how things have always been. And I think that's the piece that, this collaboration is really great about kind of coming to a common ground together, right? And establishing kind of, foundational language that we can all agree on to really create productive and fruitful projects that are needed in our community. Because I think ultimately the goals for us is creating, sustainable change in our communities, right? And there's a lot of considerations, as you saw from the report thing, right? Like, just simply investing in technology in our community can't just be done willy-nilly, right? You got to take into consideration, like, what's the impact on housing? What's the impact on jobs, right? There's a lot of things to be considered, right? And for a long time in the advocacy world, everything has worked in silos of each other, right? You talk about environmental here, you talk about transportation here, and housing over there. And more now, we realize, no, the actual approach is intersectional, right? Because in our communities, all these things are being impacted at the same time. It's not done, in sections, right? And the solutions have to be intersectional. It can't be a process of like, well, I'm an engineer, I don't talk about housing. It's like, no, well, your project is going to impact housing in my community, so you need to learn to talk about housing, right? Or let's bring in people to the table who can talk about housing, right? I think that's the piece that where the culture of advocacy has gone now.
You said it, brother. It's an interesting question. When you said that, I was like, we do everything for the culture. Everything's for the culture. But what is the culture of? I can only speak for my lived experience. So I think I would describe the culture that we're building with our community to be one of power sharing, to be one of dignity, to be one of respect. It's definitely horizontal. It's not vertical. It's one of knowledge sharing and bringing people into a different understanding of their material conditions, which is very different from, I can't speak about the culture of engineering because I'm not an engineer, but from the community, it's very much what Andres said, right? We see these people coming into our spaces for the purpose of extraction, for the purpose of observation, right? It almost makes you feel, it's almost zoological when you think about it. And I think that's why there's so much hesitation to engage with processes of research, because they feel colonial to some extent. And I think that's not what we want in the space, and I think sometimes that feeling transfers into how people see and understand agencies that deal with transportation management, right? Like they feel colonial. They feel like they are not taking your lived experience into consideration, which is one, it could lead to like what I described before, like a divestment, right? A lack of trying to engage, which only feeds into the conditions, right? Like, we feel like certain agencies don't act in the benefit of community. And then because we feel like that, we want to engage with them, and it just continues and continues and continues. But I think that's what I appreciate about Traction, that's not the vibe, for lack of better terms, that was in the room. It actually lent itself to power sharing. And I think in the space, that's the type of thinking we want to have, right? In our campaign committees, in our organizing committees, we're trying to reimagine what processes and structures can be beyond what we currently experience, right? Like I think a lot of the things that we see now are very constrained under larger structures like capitalism, white supremacy, elitism, and that's what we're trying to move away from. So, yeah, and I think that in order to create this new culture that we want, we have to be brave enough to think about things drastically different, right? Like I remember in one of our conversations, we were talking about like, why isn't there a writer on the Metro board, right? Like, why isn't there 2 or 3 writers on the Metro board that can make decisions about how the agency is running? But I think in order to have the culture that we want and that we kind of took our first steps towards in Traction, we have to be brave to make those, or to think differently about the ways that we're operating.
Those are some really great lessons. I just want to kind of let that sit just for a moment. Remind folks that I'm going to have a couple more questions. We're going to turn it over to you all. So if you want to kind of put your thoughts in slido.com, there'll be kind of the event code. They'll be flashing behind me. But yeah, I mean, I think that it's a really, it's very inspirational. And I think it's a really good sign that, you know, Oscar, you can share that, you know, the kind of the vibes in the room and the kind of feeling with this process really was aligned with the feeling of what you're trying to do in organizing, right? Because like at the end of the day, this, you know, the research will be better. And, you know, it will be kind of a new frontier, to kind of Tierra's point, that, you know, maybe people aren't comfortable with, but if everyone's kind of willing to be brave in that process, right? And like, make space for things that maybe not be part of the direct conversation. I think that's kind of something that folks have mentioned here, is that like, I love this idea about kind of transportation as an intersectional kind of sector, right? And that, you know, I think when we kind of describe intersectionality, it's a lot about kind of individual experiences and how these kind of compound. But now I think we're kind of in a space in transportation that it's not just about the kind of compounding inequities and intersectionality that people bring, but just how the field itself brings. And you have to have space in those conversations for people to say like, yeah, I mean, transportation has problems, but like, you know, mine's really like that, you know, I can't get my landlord to fix this problem, you know, and that like having space for that, whether it's in a research process, advocacy, community engagement, you know, is really kind of important. Because I think when you are telling people that's actually not what's on the table today, we're not talking about that today, right? Like that shuts people down. And I think like it's really good as a lesson to think about in this kind of research agenda process, is that you got to have space for everything, right? And if it's like, yeah, let's talk about something else, cool, like let's do it. You know, don't let this is, you know, the process is having, you know, space for everything there. So kind of thinking, next question I'll ask Andres to kind of start with his thoughts. You know, how do we get to outcomes, right? Like this is, you know, equity is both a process and an outcome, right? And so the goals of the traction effort are around improving knowledge and power sharing as outcomes. But like, how do we achieve these goals, right? Like, you know, what would you kind of like to see kind of as next steps, or what were kind of, you know, breadcrumbs that you saw that you're like, oh, maybe we can do that, or this will be useful to my work through this type of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a big part of it is, as an advocate, as an organizer, we're strong on the narrative piece, right? We hear the stories of the community on the daily, right? But when we engage, you know, decision makers, a key component that's missing is the data to back these narratives that we're saying. And unfortunately, we're in a world where narratives are not enough, right? The value of people's lives are not enough, frankly, right? But if you're able to show a trend in data that puts a bad light on a decision maker, that gives you leverage to do some stuff, right? So I think that's the potential I see with this whole traction process, right? That we've initiated conversations for potential research projects that are necessary, that are needed, and can really be utilized to you know, push a better future for our region, right? You know, right now is an important moment because, you know, in the LA landscape, there's major events coming in that are going to impact housing, transportation, and all of it, right? You know, the region's getting ready for the Olympics, the region's getting ready for a World Cup, and even a Super Bowl, right? And this is all of a sudden created a priority for agencies like Metro. They want to fast track projects, they want to do all these kind of things, right? But the worry for us is who are you prioritizing that, right? Are you building these projects for tourists coming to the city and making it, you know, facilitate a process for tourists to get around in our region? Or is it being planned for the people that live here, who are going to continue using these systems past these events, right? I think that's an important question that we want to be prepared for, right? And we want to have the data to back up, you know, what we're talking about, right? This is an idea and a thought of things that are occurring years from in the future, but we need to be prepared now, right? So I think the other piece, I think, and I appreciate the traction process that has created a lot of bridges with academics that I didn't have before, right? And I feel comfortable in, you know, create a safe space to be honest, right? You know, a few years back, I wouldn't talk like this in a panel like in the space like this, right? Because, the game, right? You don't want to ruffle feathers of people you might want to work with, right? But I think we've created a space where there could be full transparency, full honesty, that, hey, these are the challenges that we're seeing, and how do we address them together, right? And I think that's what, for me, what Traction has really a product of the Traction process, right? Creating those bridges, those lines of communications, and that trust. Because Oscar touched on this earlier, right? These extractive relationships have created a real distrust of academia, right? There's there's a lot of universities in Los Angeles, right? The two biggest, UCLA and USC, hardly do research in our communities. That's real, that's fact. You know what I mean? Y'all do amazing research all over the world, except for our communities. And that's the part that we want to challenge and change. And I think Traction is on that track.
Yeah. So Tierra, what do you think in terms of I think following up on how does UCLA and the partners in the room, how do we kind of think about achieving these goals of improving knowledge and power sharing?
Yeah, so I'm a part of a project where we're looking at this question of what does equitable community engagement look like? And the first thing I'll say is that prior to this, I recognized that universities, we just have not done a great job with community engagement. We have not done a great job with recognizing and elevating sort of the value of community engagement with all of these other things that universities do. And so, the sad news is that we're in this place where we have to kind of clean up, issues from the past and rebuild relationships and rebuild trust and maintain genuine connections with community members and community advocates and organizations. And so we're in this space where, communities are tired. They're tired of folks coming in and, making promises or, sort of just smoke and mirrors and, not being transparent about where this information is going, how it's going to affect them. So there's a lot of things that we have not done well. And I think that for this project that I'm working on now, it's been an opportunity to kind of look at what a transportation agency does and, go to community meetings and talk to people and, kind of pretend like I'm just, a community member, but I'm really assessing. And then also look at best practices from, not just sort of the transportation literature, but other fields that do this, I think better than we do in transportation, like in healthcare and social work and, just a number of other disciplines. So there's a lot that we can learn about better practices from other domains to bring into transportation. I think that's something really important to recognize. But, just trying to follow up on the points about trust and about, approaches that are not extractive, but about co-development and research and information exchange. And so, I think the points is that, we're at a place where at least I think that there's a renewed attention to the significance of community engagement. I know that agencies are putting out reports about their experiences working with community-based organizations, and they don't look great, but the idea is that, they are, organizations like SCAG and MTC in San Francisco, they are trying to pay more attention to these things and focus on how do we maintain these connections and not just, go in and collect data and ask for feedback when we need something. And then, the other thing I'll say is that from the research perspective, I think that, again, examples like Traction should be something that, hopefully would do more regularly, but, I really hope to see more faculty participate and see, potential models for integrating community engagement with the other research activities that they do, and also recognizing that there's a way to do it, right? Making sure that you save space for people to just share, right? It might deviate from what your research agenda is, but in that process, you learn so much about the community. You provide opportunity to make lasting and genuine links. For me as a researcher, I'm always trying to understand how to connect to people. What is it about what we're doing that is deviating from what they say they need? What are some ways that we can sort of make sure that there's an exchange, so with my projects, we often do simple things like we put together websites and small reports. And once we collect some data, we have some opportunities to share that, whether it be through a website or a pamphlet to say, hey, we can't pay you for your time. The transportation improvements that will get built might not happen for, some time, sometimes decades, but there's an important value that you've contributed. And so recognizing that and trying to think of some clear ways for there to be an exchange, I think are just essential. And so my hope is that we will see more examples like Traction. We will see Traction itself happen more in this community, and that we'll be at a place where we can demonstrate better ways of engagement that both make the research that we do better, but also are closer to meeting what the community needs are.
Yeah, I think that kind of highlights, something that we probably all heard, is kind of like the go slow to go fast. You say it too fast, it's gonna be one word, but yes, obviously right now in the Los Angeles region, there's a lot of need to deliver a lot of these projects on a short window. And if you haven't, if agencies or partners haven't spent the time building those relationships in a really slow and deliberate way, it's going to make the process of going fast very difficult. And it's not just going to be this next kind of few years run up to the Olympics. That is our current, we need to go fast, but climate change, there's a lot of things need to go fast. Tierra, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, we are starting to see some examples of agencies thinking out of the box. So, one of the things that we learned is about some activities and engagements on the part of LA Metro to do things like community mapping, to have people participate in the mapping process where they ask them questions like, where are some locations that, that bring you joy in this community? Where are some locations that you think are really positive? So trying to, this space of advancing equity tends to we focus on burdens and, terrible things that have happened in the past that continue to affect people. And it's important to understand those things, to connect past decision-making to harm and things like that. But it's also really essential from a community engagement perspective for us to be operating in hope. There's opportunity for the future to do things better. And so, there's an example where LA Metro is doing community mapping, and partnering with an arts program. And, things like this are just really important. And I think that there are opportunities to do more things like this where, we recognize, okay, these are the activities that agencies need to engage in. This is the value that communities can bring. What are some out of the box approaches for these two places to meet other than traditional extractive processes? Yeah.
Ask you one.
Yeah, I had a couple of things. The questions about outcomes, right? At Sage, we have researchers and we usually create teams by teaming up someone who is experienced in the research domain and then someone who is experienced in the community building, base building, organizing domain. And then we both do advocacy together, which I think is a great structure. And I think we're engaging in, co-planning and co-thinking of what our policy platforms are going to be, So for example, we do something called the People's Planning School, where we go in and we use popular education tools to really make land use theories and thinking more accessible to our community. And we're thinking of doing something similar, we're trying to create a people's transportation planning school, So if anyone's interested in volunteering for that, let me know. And we really want to talk to these communities and get them to understand concepts like a road diet, right? Or why adding a lane to a freeway isn't actually going to reduce the traffic that you experience on it, right? These are the things that we are trying to engage with our community because, I think it's in order to create that bridge, right? We need to create understanding in the community, and also we need to help our researchers be able to not lean into those extractive methods that it has kind of been the practice that I've observed. And I think the only other thing that I'll say is like, you know, one person that I really look up to, Fred Hampton, said that like, without education, we're just engaging in neocolonialism, right? And I think that's really at the center of our praxis, right? Like if we're really going to be co-thinking and co-creating policy recommendations, then we would need to deeply engage in educational practices with our members so they can then really engage with the material that we're trying to create. So yeah. Mhm.
Can I add? I mean, that means creating space to talk about research results, which rarely happens, right? That's something that we talked about in the prep call to this, right? Like that's something that I think hopefully will be a result from this traction process, right? A commitment to awesome research is done. This is the data collected and break down the results, right? More so than just publishing a report, right? But actually having space to really engage with people. Like, look, this is what your input resulted in, right? This is significance of it. This is the recommendation based on it, right? So folks feel like, okay, my experience, my points of view are valued, right? And this, I think, is something that we feel it's weirdly rarity, right? Like, because we both of us have done community research projects, even community research projects, right? But we don't see the results, right? We're given a report like, hey, this is what we found, right? We oftentimes find ourselves trying to break that down into the community, right? So I think having that partnership exist, I think it's going to be fruitful.
Yeah, I mean, I think I want to emphasize in kind of both of these remarks is that, you know, research is not just stuff that's done at the university, right? Like I really want to uplift Sage's research report on fare free transit. Like there's really great work that really knitted together quantitative data, stories from riders, and then having an event at the end just to like bring those people and be like, hey, we're releasing this thing. Let's get together and eat and drink and like have that community to kind of keep the conversation going. Cause like the end of the research is the beginning of the process, right? And I think that's also relates to, you know, kind of think, you know, Tierra was just talking about the models for community engagement. You know, one thing that there's a book that's called The Trouble with City Planning. And it's written by the former city planning director in New Orleans. And one of the lessons I took from that book was that every time you start a new master planning process, you just start from that point in time and not like, hey, what did we learn in the last time? And so we're going to start from there so that you're not like just having people re-explain their same problems, but like, what did we learn? Okay, so now we're going to go forward. I think that relates to both kind of community engagement and to the research process. So I'm going to show out one last question and then turn it over to Slido and you all. You know, I think we already kind of started talking about this. You've hit on this a lot, but like, what do you want to come out of this process, right? Like, is it topics, new collaborations? Like, you know, if you were going to grab something from the report or from your experience and say, this is what I want to lead as a result of participating, like, what would that look like? I'm gonna start with Tierra.
Yeah, so, you know, my hope is that on one hand, we can have more meaningful research that matters and moves the needle and contributes to people's lives, that we have better data that is reflective of the needs of communities, that we have that we're trying to study and advance you know, services and improvements that will really meet people's needs. So just, you know, a closer tie between what the needs are and the things that we do in research and the things that we prioritize and focus on. But the other thing is, you know, I think I try to touch on, I live in this space where I'm a part of a discipline that, you know, has not and still doesn't fully recognize the significance of equity focused and community focused work. And so my hope is that there will be more opportunities to demonstrate the value so that we can have you know, more researchers who, you know, who have these sort of guiding principles of the value of community engagement and how that makes the work itself better, that improves our ability to, you know, take the things that we develop and put them into practice and put them into application. And so I feel like I'm in this space where I'm hearing, what people say, and I want to model that in my work, but I also want this to serve as a demonstration for, not just current academics, but, the future of transportation researchers and planners, right? So making sure that we are building this into our teaching, that we have more classes that show, well, this is, how we have learned things in the past, but this is how we know things break down. If we have community engaged research, these are the results and the priorities that we end up with in comparison to a classical approach. So more opportunities to demonstrate the value so that we can have genuine buy-in and so that we can sort of shift these perspectives and the way that we do classical engineering and transportation planning.
Andres, what are you picking up next?
I mean, that part. I think a result too would be building real partnerships amongst our communities and the academic institutions. I think that's an important piece of me, right? That I feel could be a result of the work that we're doing. I think also, shifting paradigms, right? I think acknowledging that post-pandemic, we're living in a world that, it's easier just to zoom things in as opposed to interact, analog, right, with people. And I think that's a piece that we have to kind of challenge ourselves to uplift, right? Like, I want to see more researchers come to these communities to get to know them before you start like creating plans and whatnot, right? And I think this is a good step forward for that.
What I want to get out of this?
Or what do you want? What do you want to come next? Like,
What
is
do you
it
come next?
topics? Is it collaboration?
Yeah.
Like, yeah, you put in tons of time. So
Yeah.
like, how do you reap the benefits? Like,
Yeah. Well, one is, again, I'm a plug it again. This People's Transportation Plan School, that definitely was going to come next for us specifically. But I agree with Andres, like a paradigm shift. Like, what knowledge do we consider legitimate, or what knowledge are we prioritizing? Is it only empirical? I mean, I love empirical knowledge, but there's also cultural knowledge, right? There's also, anecdotal. Even though it's very limited and you can't extrapolate something from anecdotal, but anecdotal knowledge is important. Cultural knowledge is important. I would also say partnerships, right? I would love for folks, in this room to come to our transportation campaign committee, which happens every second Tuesday of the month, and talk to some of the señoras and señores that we organize with, and yeah, and I think what Andres says, like, really look into what comes out of this report, right? How can we really make it material and impactful to not only researchers, people at UCLA, but also our community. And yeah.
Tierra, go ahead.
Very selfishly, I want to say that there are some real outcomes already from traction. So Andreas and I are collaborating on a project that's going to be launching in the summer. He's also participating in some other projects. And so, I just want to share that there are some real and tangible outcomes already. And by the end of the summer, we'll have results from that collaboration. So on one hand, we will have collected a new rich data set. We'll also have sort of co-developed new methods for community engagement. So I'm very excited about that.
We're trying to model, y'all. We're not just talking mess.
Walk the walk.
That's great. So I'm going to turn it over to Amy Lee, who's a postdoctoral scholar with the Institute of Transportation Studies. And my colleague Phoebe is grabbing a mic. And so Amy's going to share so how this is going to work during our Q&A. The Slido moderator is going to kind of say who the question is going to. Phoebe will run the mic to you. If you could introduce yourself and then give your question. So Amy is going to kind of and we're going to figure out how this goes as we go. So who's the first question to? And Amy's going to have to shout it out.
Sonia Lugo. Thank you. I'm another UCLA ITS colleague. Hooray. So appreciate you all and your insights. I feel really fortunate to be collaborating with you in various ways. And the question I had is, one of the challenges when it comes to bringing more community knowledge into academic research is where do we find the line between beneficial and extractive? Like, how deep should we be asking our community experts to be engaging? And so I'm just kind of curious, you've talked about some of this, right? And absolutely, Oscar, oh my gosh, the People's Transportation Planning School, we're back here snapping to that. We're ready to engage.
Nice.
But so what are some models, researchers being embedded within community-based organizations like TALA at ACT LA? Should we be thinking toward having fellowships where community experts are kind of like in the mix, talking to researchers, an advisory group that's like getting a rundown on proposed research projects? Just what are some ideas?
Who wants to go first?
All of that.
All of that.
No, I mean, I think that's the capacity part from our end a lot of times, right? We don't know that process of framing the kind of research we need, right? So I think having spaces to kind of have that, brainstorming go on, I think could be really fruitful. Yeah, I mean, not all organizations have research capacity, so props to Sage, but having like fellowships, interns like that want to engage more in the community, I think is always productive, because I think they get that hands-on on the ground what things are looking like, right? And it may not be a direct project they may be working on, but I think that experience can only be fruitful for future researchers, right? I don't know.
No, I agree. I think it's all of the things you mentioned, Adonia, and it's really about maybe creating relation before you then come with an ask of research. It's about coming to these committee meetings, participating in door knocking, right? Getting on the ground, doing some field work, right? So that you can then, when you make that ask, we can look at you with more legitimacy rather than someone who's just there to extract.
Yeah, don't come to the table with a thought out, like, this is what we're doing, can you help us? That turns us off, right? I'd rather be more of a conversation that this is an opportunity for research. What do you all think? Is there potential for collaboration to feel more like a partner as opposed to like, someone you're extracting information from, right?
Yeah, so such a great question, Adonia, and I don't have a good answer. I don't know, but what I will say are two things. One is, for researchers recognizing that there is a line, and it's very easy to transition from something that is well-meaning to something that is very very extractive and very much aligns with how things have been done in the past. And so I think that, one thing that I often do is when I'm approaching, a research grant, it's always about, okay, well, there are opportunities to, answer this, whatever this research question is, but there's also an opportunity to advance the approach for doing this. And I think that that has to include things like, making sure that we are, starting from a place of, I don't know all of the answers, and I'm going to work with people who do have the community knowledge to make sure that we arrive at a process that that satisfies our objectives. And then the other thing is, just making sure that researchers recognize that it's important for this to be a mutually beneficial activity. So yes, I have my objectives. I need to answer this question, but I also have to recognize that I can't get there without help, and I can't deliver something that's going to be meaningful without making sure that there's space for co-development. And so that needs to be built into the budget for how we design research programs and research grants. But there needs to be just way more attention to the fact that the status quo is it needs to be advanced. And so this needs to be a mutual process. And exactly what that looks like, I think is also a research question. And so my hope is that, this is something that we can learn, as we participate in this process. So I don't know, that probably doesn't answer, the question, but.
I'll add another thing real quick. I think also coming with resources, right? A lot of people are working class, so they're not gonna just spend 2 hours for free, to be honest, So definitely coming with resources. And I also think coming with a deeper understanding. A book I'll recommend to everybody to read is Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon. I think everybody needs to read that. And I think it provides a perspective that is very useful when you're thinking about how to engage with people or like where people are coming from.
One additional thing. So many agencies are, especially at the federal level, they're grappling with this question as well, right? So when it comes to discretionary programming, how do we make sure that community organizations, we respect applications and support capacity for community organizations to also submit to grants, right? And so, I think that there are ideas related to how do we build capacity? How do we make sure that if you have an organization that has great ideas and wants to put forth a great proposal, but perhaps doesn't have, certain research capacity or access to data or what have you, that there's a way to provide that so that it's not always the sort of top down. We have agencies that have the best resources, submit for programs, but we also empower community organizations that tend not to be successful in these applications to do just that. And so that we can arrive at better projects.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think kind of getting into the weeds is something to kind of talk about interaction, but kind of to that point, it's like just in procurement and how we pay people. Like you can't expect people to say, hey, we're a partner, come on to this project. You'll maybe get paid in 6 to 12 months, but you got to do the work now. Like there's a big reimagining of this process from government. Too often we see things like, sorry, your grant can't pay for childcare. This grant can't pay for food. And like, these are like, to kind of Adonia's questions, like these are how like partners can get benefits, but without being extractive is you actually literally provide people what they need. And like, we just got to push back against that and any opportunity. So Amy, next question.
Hello. My name is Tafari Bain, Chief Strategist with Ciclavia. I love these guys. I guess my question is actually more for the room, and Andres touched on it for a bit earlier. I come from a community organizing background, and I have the great pleasure of working for an organization right now that is very innovative in the space around how we use ephemeral events, how we use activations to transform how people see their city. But with these kinds of projects, we get to the point where we're trying to think about, well, what are the right questions? What is the data that we need to gather in order to shift power and change narratives? How do you take that experience and translate it in a way that can push policy or move decision makers, besides like having them come to my awesome event and just feeling it, right? Because that definitely happens, and they start thinking about, oh, we could put bike lanes in this community, but I'm to the point of walking the walk. I'm going to hit up Madeline. We already talked about how do we measure joy, right? Like how do you create the data that talks about the effects of joy and how that joy transforms how people vote, how people want to change their neighborhood. So I kind of put it out there to the room, and in a sense, and would love for you guys to speak on it a bit, but it's about how do we co-generate the kinds of questions, the kinds of research we need that actually pushes shit and actually makes the change, right? Because I come from a campaign background, so how do you put that stuff in action? But I'm also wondering, how do we create those questions together? Because I don't know what exactly I'm looking for yet. But I'm not a researcher. I don't have the time to read. But I'm not a researcher. I'm not the university side. So, how do we create those kind of rooms? I guess is kind of the question I'm putting out there.
I mean, I think Traction kind of modeled this really well, right? Is convening in a room and really talking about what's the landscape, right? Like what are the issues that are pertinent right now in our communities that as we see it and as you all seen it through your perspective as well, right? And then co-develop that way. Because, you're right, Far, right? Like we're not researchers. We don't know how to develop these research questions on our own. A lot of times we're asked, yeah, awesome, come up with a research question. But let me ask the homies, right? But I think creating space with the purpose of, and I think that it's as much of the onus on our organizations, but also within academic institutions, right? Yeah, be in tune with what's going on locally, right? And yeah, maybe it's not directly impacted to your field of academics or whatever, right? But it's good to know, because then when these conversations come up, we're not starting from square zero, right? There's a common ground that we understand. Okay, these things are coming up. I'm aware of these things. Let's co-develop, right? And bring your expertise to us, and we'll bring our expertise, and we'll create that common ground, right? And I think, like I said, Traction was a great model of doing that, right? Convening, having these conversations, you know, and co-developing. Like this is what we're seeing as the need in this community now.
Yeah, so I would go back to the example that Andres gave about when we present the information. So we go in and we collect some information, some feedback, and then we do some analysis and processing, and then making it a standard activity for us to then represent that information to community members. And I think that something like that, say that, for every grant, right? There's always a component that has to do with broadening participation or, things like this. And so what if, a standard requirement was to do community presentations? And so then we would need to make sure that we're able to, communicate what we've done, the value, how it addresses our needs, how it might be useful to community members. And so I think something like that is really attractive. We're going to be modeling that in our project, and it presents an opportunity to, for community members to learn to start with something and then give their feedback, ask questions. That helps us to learn, okay, well, we're not doing something right. Or this aspect here is the most important thing, right? This is the thing that's going to be the most convincing. This is the thing that's going to move the needle. This is the thing that people resonate with. So I think, more opportunities for, not just the initial engagement, but, on the back end, the presentation of the results. I think that's, I see that as being a really essential part that might also help activists to also identify data and learn in that process as well.
Your question is, how do we create the space, right? And I think for me, it's like, one, you have to come at it with humility, both on the researcher and for us as well. I think an understanding of positionality, right? UCLA, right? I went to UCSB, so shout out to UCSB, but like your positionality to structures and institutions of power. And I think also an openness to be challenged and to learn, and also like, seeing where the land, like we are already working on stuff, right? Where we have campaign goals, we have organizing goals. So how can you align your research agenda to that, which is what Traction did. So props to Traction. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Great. Amy, next question.
Thank you.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Alexander from CityFi. I had a question about dignity, not too dissimilar from Tafari's question. How do you measure dignity? And are researchers thinking about dignity, engineers thinking about dignity? The reason I ask is because I think if you can answer that, it does have real, business impacts, policy impacts, good outcomes for everybody. We saw this in medical transportation. We couldn't figure out what dignity meant for years because we were sending clean vehicles, professionally dressed drivers, well-equipped new vehicles. But the community members and the users told us, I don't like to ride in a government vehicle. When we took the logo off some of these vehicles, we saw an increase by 40%, right, in adherence to trips. So how do we do that better? It took us a long time to figure that out. How do we figure this out faster?
So I imagine, I don't know, but I imagine that what dignity looks like will be different for different applications. And I think that I can't say that it's something that, I can't say that that's the type of language that we use in like the tribal behavior space. But one of the things that comes up more and more is this issue of trust. And the issue of, not really understanding what the gap is. So we're providing something, say that we're trying to pilot microtransit. We're providing this service. It's free. It goes to where people want to go or what have you. But in my experience and in my sort of, informal assessments of some of these pilots, often the issue of trust comes up. So, people don't want to rely on a pilot. They don't want to adjust their lives for something that may not be there next year. There's skepticism about, if I'm using my cell phone and there's data and transactions, I'm inputting like credit cards and so forth, where's that information going? So this issue of trust in terms of like, data and security and reliability and whether this is going to be there when I need it or whether there's going to be some sort of pivot because that's what history tells us, it's a real thing. And so I think that this is something that some researchers do recognize, but are we, actively sort of, building our strategies around this understanding of that there is a trust barrier, there is a need to make sure that people can travel with dignity, that they're not harassed by police and things like this, we're not at a place where we're doing a good job of recognizing those things, but we do have some other related language that I think folks who are in this space, this equity space, do recognize and are actively working to understand.
I love that question. 5 minutes, okay.
Keep it short.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, homie, I have to think about that, but I think, my first reaction is listening. Obviously, we have to listen. And I think that's, what y'all did, right? You took time to listen and ask people like what's making you uncomfortable when you're running the ambulance. And I think it's very similar for transportation, but I think, I don't know, our communities are so used to their experiences not being valued for them to be kind of like a third, fourth, fifth consideration rather than the first, that I think to Tierra's point, like it's about really showing up with authenticity, and yeah, that's what I have so far, but I'll keep thinking about it. We should connect.
Yeah. The only thing I would add to that, I think acknowledgement of, the fact that, our institutions have been extractive or we live in systems that have devalued you as an important first step, right? Because oftentimes none of that is acknowledged, right? I'm not the racist, it was those guys over there, right? But you know what I mean? Like, whether you like it or not, you represent systems that have been racist to us for a long time, right? Or extractive or whatever you want to call it, right? There's also power in language. This is one thing that always made me uncomfortable with research stuff, right? Of, the onus to call people subjects, right? For the sake of whatever, right? But I think there's a power in language, right? And that's fine if you have to refer to people as subjects in your research and stuff, but don't do that shit to people because then they'll be like, what? I ain't nobody's subject, bro. Like, what's going on with that, right? But I've seen that a lot of times, right? A lot of times researchers coming in and they just speak their jargon, right? And are totally like blind to that fact. So that's the only thing I would add to the dignity piece, right? Like,
So I just, in response to that, I want to reiterate, and this is what, one of the things that Andreas just said is this, recognizing and communicating the value that these experiences have and the importance that they have in the research and decision-making. And the example that I'll give is that I have designed surveys and done my, sort of beta testing and, or I think I have a quality product to put out and collect data. And then I've learned in the community workshop that, in this community, they don't refer to bus as fixed bus. They refer to it as the special service. And then bus is actually like an on-demand service. And so there will be things like this that we don't know. And if I hadn't talked to people, if I hadn't recognized the value that they bring, I would have released this survey and wasted thousands of dollars, So I think that one of the things that I'm hearing is that we have to continue to communicate the value that communities bring and that this is important for, like, I value you, right? I value the contribution that you bring. I'm not here just to take something from you. I'm here so that we can make sure that this is both a benefit to community as well as to the research.
Yeah, I just want to uplift the Thrivance group and Dr. Destiny Thomas, who actually puts on a Dignity Institute. So if you're interested, if you're a professional that would love to just really dig in, they're actually kind of back in person, actually like it's in June in Berkeley. So that's a really great model of like, let's think about that. I think that there's really importance in talking to people and kind of raising this up. And at the same time, just recognizing like you should kind of ask yourself, like, you know, is this a dignifying trial experience? For example, 1 in 4 metro bus stops, only 1 in 4 has a bus shelter. Do you think 75% of like standing in the sun and 75% of our bus stops is a dignified experience? Like, I don't think we necessarily need to have focus groups to answer that question. So both just kind of thinking about it and engaging it are really important. If you want to learn more, there's tools for that. I'm going to wrap us up and then we're going to move on to the next session quickly, and then we'll go to lunch. So just a couple of themes, you know, I think we really heard about language, thinking about, you know, intimidating language as a way to kind of create a barrier between different parties and how you really think about that. Humility, trust building, space for dialogue, and space for kind of thinking beyond what you're just there to do. So join me in thanking our excellent panel.